Hey, welcome back to Unqualified Critics, and if you watched my last video, you know I'm expecting 2D sprite-based racing games like Outrun from Arcade1up before we get to the good stuff. And as awesome as Outrun was, and it is a very cool game, racing games really didn't come into their own until the advent of 3D polygon-based graphics in the 90s.
It's the 90s.
In their original form, some of these cabinets included complex mechanical movements, recreating the movement of the car. But they also had force feedback in some of the steering wheels. These cabinets were a production. I recall a huge 10-person lineup of special edition Daytona USA cabs that took up an entire wall at GameWorks, which was a major arcade in the early 2000s. And the racing cockpits themselves would shift with the on-screen action. There was just nothing like it before these games in the arcade. Now we're going to look at these cabinets based on 3 factors to figure out which ones we think are going to be coming first from Arcade1up. And those factors are licensing. Is this game a license that can be attainable for Arcade1up? That counts out something like Mario Kart Grand Prix, by the way. Name recognition. Does Joe on the street know what this game is? Because that's what retailers like Walmart are looking for. Bundleability. Are there multiple games that can be packaged into a single cabinet and sold if need be, since that's something Arcade1up looks at? Let's jump right in, guys. First game up is San Francisco Rush. I absolutely love this game, and before San Francisco had roving homeless people and needles on the ground and all the issues it has today, it had epic and stunning hills, winding streets. This setting has been featured in more movies than I can count. Placing an over-the-top racing game in this setting was a stroke of genius for Atari, and they needed it because they were trying to compete with the Ridge Racers and the Daytona USAs of the world that came before it, and both were smash successes. The cabinet itself is hilariously 90s with the funky green color and speakers blasting at you from all directions. There's 2 in front and 2 behind. There is a 5th speaker. I'm not even 100% sure where that is, maybe underneath the seat. Surround sound tech was garbo in the 90s, but somehow that didn't stop us from trying to cram as many speakers into as many places as we could. And you know what? I'm fine with that. The cabinet looked cool, it was loud, and let's go. I'd love to see if Arcade1up builds this cabinet that they actually keep and maintain the 5-speaker placement from the original. Every Walmart under the sun seemingly had a Rush cabinet in the front of the store, so it seems like this was predestined that they should eventually sell home versions of this cabinet for us to have. I'd love to see a Rush, and I think it's a very likely cabinet to be released from Arcade1up. On the licensing front, Rush was published by Atari in the arcade. Now, many of you may know this as a Midway game because you've played it either in its subsequent re-releases or you've played it on Nintendo 64 like I did. That was Midway publishing it only for the console. This was an Atari game for arcades, which would be the ROM Arcade1up would be licensing. And we know Arcade1up has a strong relationship with Atari, and they have a good relationship with Midway too, in case that ever comes up. So I really think licensing here is fine. Notably, when this game was re-released on the Xbox and PS2 in the Midway Arcade Treasures game, it came with different music than the arcade original. Hopefully that was a creative choice and not some weird licensing limitation. Our next factor is name recognition, and San Francisco Rush was extremely popular in arcades. There's just no denying it. It re-established Atari as an arcade powerhouse. Now, partly this was due to Rush being developed for existing graphics hardware rather than building custom arcade hardware, making it cheaper to develop and subsequently manufacture, resulting in a lower cost for arcades. Probably explains why Walmart bought so many of them. So what games can we bundle to make this a complete Arcade1up cab? Before you say Rush 2 in the comments, know that that was a console exclusive, so that's not going to work here since Arcade1up has only ever licensed arcade ROMs. Rush 2049 was an arcade game, but it ran on more advanced hardware than the original, and it doesn't have as much name recognition, so I don't think we would get that. Next is Cruisin USA. I believe that Arcade1up will build a Cruisin USA cabinet. Now, believe it or not, and I was surprised by this, Cruisin USA outsold Daytona USA in US arcade sales. I didn't expect that. I thought Daytona USA was the bigger of the 2 games. Now, like Outrun and the era before it, Cruisin USA really defined an era of arcade racers. It helped that there was an early Nintendo 64 game where it gained even more exposure. And that game was a major success, just further reinforcing the Cruisin brand. The standard version of this cabinet was very basic, both in its design and its features. Whereas Rush would rock your face off with 5 speakers, Cruisin USA was mono, so single speaker, which was pretty lame for a 1994 release, especially considering 1992's simplistic Virtua Racer had stereo. But Cruisin USA does have a 4-position gear shifter, which is cool and makes it feel like you're actually driving a 90s Ferrari. Published by Midway Games in the arcade, licensing on this should be no problem. And it is the top pick for name recognition. There's just no question Arcade1up could sell Cruisin USA. Its direct sequel, Cruisin World, runs on the exact same arcade platform. So if you can emulate Cruisin USA, you can emulate Cruisin World, making it an obvious fit for a 2-game bundle package. Now, a few years later, we saw Cruisin Exotica, and I've seen some of you in the comments bring this game up. I don't think I've played it before, but I've seen video of it. It looks really good. I'm leaving that out because it ran on much more demanding hardware than Cruisin USA, so I don't think we would get that packaged here. And of course, Midway had other racing games that we could shoehorn in, but I'd rather keep this cabinet pure. I think that these racing games are so exciting and people want them so badly that we'd rather have a Cruisin cabinet rather than a Cruisin cabinet with 10 other games shoehorned in here that maybe aren't a fit. On to the next game, Daytona USA. You knew this had to be included and it has to be released by Arcade1up. Cruisin USA may have sold more units, but nothing had a bigger impact on arcades than just it dominating the arcade itself. It always got prominent featuring with placement within the arcade, and it would attract so many people. Now, on one hand, when I put this list together, I think, man, these are really obvious choices, but the reality is these big name recognizable all-star cabinets, that's exactly what Arcade1up is going to want to release to ensure success for their racing line. Daytona USA had the best graphics seen to date in the arcades when it launched. This game was a revelation. It debuted on Sega's all-new Model 2 arcade board. It featured a buttery smooth 60 frames per second and a brand new effect called texture filtering. I remember wondering if we would ever see this level of realism on a home console. The attract screen jingle is hilariously simplistic, but it really demands you to play it, and we all remember that proud shout. The colorful imagery of the blue sky above and those bold block colors on the car are also, I think, a big part of this cabinet's success. The game just looks so cool and so inviting. Between the look and sound, you had to play this game. Daytona USA is published by Sega, making it an obvious layup for Arcade1up, and like every other game on this list so far, this game is an easy sell. Building it to work well and capture the look and feel will be the hard part, but selling it is no problem. Daytona USA had a direct sequel, Daytona USA 2, but that used substantially more sophisticated arcade hardware, so jury is still out if Arcade1up would want to deal with emulating it. This is a Sega cabinet after all, so they could throw in a simpler 3D racer that they may not want to give its own cabinet, but that many of us would want to play, like Virtua Racing. That game's iconic in its own right, but probably not well known enough to warrant its own cab. But Daytona USA could sell on its own, like many of the games I'm mentioning here. So if this wasn't bundled with anything else, I don't think that hurts it. I think Arcade1up could do a simple standalone Daytona USA and get tons of sales. My next pick is just a little less famous than the other games I've mentioned so far, but for a couple reasons that I'll get into, this is my dark horse pick that I don't really expect from Arcade1up. The other games I mentioned, I very much do expect. This one is Crazy Taxi. Now, my bet is that all of you have heard of this game. I just question awareness of Crazy Taxi outside of core gamers. I remember this game playing at the nearly perfect arcade port on Dreamcast, but of course, this was a major arcade release as well. The soundtrack, the open world that you could drive anywhere. I mean, this game was so cool, and again, just a step forward for, and again, it's not really a racing game, but a step forward for driving games. It ran on Sega's Naomi board, and that's the main reason we're unlikely to see a release from Arcade1up. We're talking about serious hardware, but should it happen anyway? Hell yes, it should. Published by Sega with having had re-releases, licensing on the game is no problem. The music, on the other hand, and that's the other reason I think we won't get this cabinet, all the modern re-releases I know of have scratched the original soundtrack by The Offspring. That soundtrack was awesome though, and I think a big part of the game's success. If we got an arcade re-release of this but without the original soundtrack, that would be unfortunate. but I don't count anything out completely. Remember, NBA Jam was supposed to be impossible to re-release, but Arcade1up is making that happen. They're nothing if not very good at licensing arrangements. Name recognition I think is good here. I don't think it's as good as any of the other games I've covered. And for bundling, there were several Crazy Taxi sequels and spin-offs, but other than an obscure Crazy Taxi themed redemption game, the kind you play for tickets, I'm not aware of any Crazy Taxi arcade games beyond the original. If you know of one, let me know below. The cabinet uses a simple 2-speed shifter for forward and reverse, so any 2-speed Sega arcade game could work here. Again, I think Virtual Racing would be a good fit. It had paddle shifters, but you could easily substitute that for the up and down nature of a two-way stick. And of course, there are so many good choices that I have to leave off here because at the end of the day, I don't think we're going to get 50 different arcade racing cabs from Arcade1up, but there are a lot of good picks that I didn't mention, so sound off in the comments. Let me know what cabinets you want to see from Arcade1up for racing games from the 90s. And of course, they're always looking for community feedback, and I know they take that very seriously. So if you guys want a certain game, let me know below in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, guys. We'll catch you next time.
Dripping lights paint the skies. I'll be